Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Armand Georgian in Paris. Iran is witnessing its largest protests since the Green Movement of 2009. While they may not be Iran's version of the Arab Spring, they undoubtedly pose a challenge both to President Hassan Rouhani and to the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. To discuss this unrest and its implications for the regime, for the region, and for Iran's fraught relations with the United States, I'm joined by Suzanne Maloney. She is Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Previously, she served on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, and she also directed a task force on U.S. policy towards Iran that was chaired by Zbigniew Brzezinski and Robert Gates. She joins me from the U.S. Capitol. Welcome to the program. Good to have you on. I'd like to start with the timing of these protests, because, of course, the grievances that are being expressed are not new. It's not just since the nuclear deal that this strata of society has been left out. So why do you think they're happening now?
Well, there are more questions than answers about what precisely precipitated the protests. There are at least two competing and possibly coexistent theories that have been articulated by Iranians. One is that adversaries within the political sphere of President Rouhani were seeking to put pressure on him, and so initially organized what was intended to be a one-off or very brief protest out in Mashhad that morphed into something and spread around the country and became quite more dramatic than it was originally intended. The other theory, and of course these could coexist, is that this is a response to recent discussions of the state of the economy, both by President Rouhani himself, a speech that he gave recently, the introduction of his budget for next year, as well as increasing allegations of corruption that have come from different ends of the political spectrum, including the former president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
So to come back to the first theory for a second, if this was opponents of Hassan Rouhani trying to stir things up, have they, in a sense, achieved a situation beyond their control now? Because, of course, we have heard these chants against the Supreme Leader, which is virtually unprecedented in the Islamic Republic.
Well, I think that's what's so notable about the way this has developed, that, in fact, the protests very quickly morphed from concerns about the price of eggs to a complete rejection of the entire spectrum of leadership within the Islamic Republic and of the system itself. We've rarely heard that kind of discourse expressed in such a public and dramatic fashion. It certainly crept into the dialogue and the rhetoric around the Green Movement as that protest and opposition movement progressed in 2009 and 2010. But this really came on day one or two of the protests, that the people who came to the streets were deeply alienated from all ends of the political spectrum and from the entire nizam, the system of the Islamic Republic. That has to be gravely concerning, even for those adversaries of President Rouhani, for hardliners, conservatives, and reformists alike.
Let's move on to the U.S. response. Of course, you've been in the policy-making sphere towards Iran for many years there. President Trump says it looks like the Iranian people, will not take it any longer. His UN ambassador has said, we want to help amplify the voices of the Iranian people. Is that wise? And if so, how do you think that should be done?
Well, I think it was inevitable that the Trump administration would come out swinging on this issue. First, Iran factors very large in their policy toward the region, and they have sought to differentiate themselves in a dramatic fashion from President Obama, who, of course, was reluctant to intervene very directly and publicly during the 2009 Green Uprising. I think that it's appropriate for the United States and for other powers that are interested in Iran, that have security interests in the region, to be expressing concerns about what's happening, to be voicing encouragement and support for those who are trying to express their political grievances and their economic grievances. I would prefer that President Trump had diplomats penning his tweets for him. But I do think the circumstances that we're in today are quite different than they were in 2009, in the sense that we are no longer trying to preserve any kind of diplomatic channels with Iran. And also, more importantly, we can see in retrospect that President Obama's strategy during the Green Movement didn't really pay off. It didn't really facilitate a diplomatic opening with the regime at the time. It certainly didn't insulate protesters from the presumptive taint of having some kind of relationship with Washington. And many felt and have expressed that they felt abandoned by the United States and the international community at that time. So I think it is quite appropriate for the governments of the world to be out there publicly and to remind Tehran that the world is watching its response.
So are you saying essentially the U.S. doesn't really have any leverage at this point, given that during President Obama's term, as you're describing it, the outreach to Iran after 2009 didn't really work, so that the U.S. doesn't really have any options at the moment? Is that basically it?
Well, we have options, but what we had in 2009 was an array of interests. And the president, I think, at that time was trying to ensure that his initiative to engage diplomatically with the Iranian government to resolve the nuclear crisis in a way that avoided conflict would not be jeopardized by any kind of public statements he might make on behalf of the protesters. He was also, I think, guided by this fear of tainting the effort. We no longer have, I think, either one of those concerns. The President Trump is not interested in diplomatic engagement with the Iranian government. It doesn't appear that the Iranian government is terribly interested in diplomatic engagement with him. And so I think it is appropriate for the United States to make a clear statement of support for individuals who are risking their lives and livelihoods to express their concerns and their political grievances.
Of course, things could actually get worse in a sense, because the administration is considering not renewing a sanctions waiver, in other words, reinstating sanctions on Iran. That presumably, from your perspective, as someone who served during a moderate Republican administration in the late 2000s, that would not be a good outcome, I imagine, from your perspective.
I think it would be a disastrous outcome if the Trump administration uses the developments inside Iran as further justification for walking away from the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal may not have been perfect, and there are many who can find ways that it might be improved, but fundamentally it takes one of our major problems off the table for at least some period of time with respect to Iran. And to resume sanctions now, for the U.S. to breach its obligations under the deal, puts us in the position of being the bad guys at a time when the world's attention should be focused on the misdeeds of the Islamic Republic of Iran toward its own people.
Just to go back to one of Trump's tweets, and this is about the regional ramifications of all this, he says the Iranians have got wise as to how their money and wealth is being stolen and squandered on terrorism. We have heard from people on the ground that Iran's involvement in regional conflicts is a factor for these demonstrators. But how big a factor do you think it is really? Are these people truly very concerned, in your reading, about Iran's involvements in Syria, Iraq, and so on?
Well, it's hard to interpret, but I think what we're hearing are slogans which ask the government to be focused on the interests of the Iranian people first and foremost, rather than engaging in regional adventurism or waging wars and fighting conflicts beyond Iran's borders. And I think that reflects a very direct interest on the part of Iranians to have a government that represents their concerns, that is foremost and always focused on trying to better their lives.
What do you think the Saudis will have made of all this?
Well, I suspect the Saudis are quite happy to see turmoil in Iran, to see Iran put on the defensive both at home and in the international community. But I think that no one should take these protests lightly. This sentiment that's being expressed by Iranians is one that we know is shared widely across the region. It came to the fore during the Arab Spring. which the Saudis were able to effectively subsidize their way out of. At this time, with greater financial pressures on Riyadh, they have real reason for concern about the satisfaction levels of their own population.
Do you think they would see this unrest as an opportunity perhaps to gain the upper hand then in Yemen, particularly because that's one of the areas where that they would presumably welcome Iran, taking its eye off the ball if it's focused on internal unrest?
Well, that may be a possibility, but I think the reality is that the Iranian security forces can walk and chew gum at the same time, as we say here in the United States. They're capable of managing their international engagements even as they turn toward the domestic front to ensure that there is no further escalation of the unrest at home. And the other issue here is that Iran's involvement in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon tends to be sustained even at times of economic pressure. I don't suspect that the concerns about the economy that are being expressed on the streets are likely to change the overall regional security policy of the Islamic Republic, because in effect it reflects the threats and the threat perception of the leadership.
We'll have to end it there. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise, Suzanne Maloney of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Stay tuned. More news coming up in a moment here on France 24.